So our cover story this week is about the life of John Arthur Getreu, who was a former Palo Alto resident, Explorer Scouts volunteer, who authorities now say murdered two women, and in those cases, they were unsolved for 45 years until last year. Somewhat shockingly, I know in your reporting we found people who found Getreu to be sort of normal, calm, rational, I think were some of the descriptors that they used. But you also dived in a little bit more to a conviction that he had in 1963 for murder.
Yes.
And you spoke with a 1975 rape victim.
Yes.
So we'll explore all of that, but I think first we need to start with DNA evidence, because it seems like DNA analyses are just breaking open cases left and right. And of course it started with the Golden State Killer case.
Right.
So that was 3 years ago, Joseph D'Angelo.
Yes.
Yeah. So DNA evidence has been used up until, well, through now, but it seems like there's a genetic component, a genealogy component that's being used.
Yeah, I would say, I'm not sure whether or not there's so much been a breakthrough in technology regarding DNA as there has been in terms of just the availability of the data.
Sure.
And so you have a lot of people who now are involved in genealogy databases and, they like Ancestry and things like that. And there are ways to link your DNA. You can have your DNA done through these organizations, and then it can be linked to your site, and you find relatives that way. My husband found a long-lost sister that way, I mean, so it can be pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And I guess law enforcement has also found a way to dip into that as well. And they can start, they have a sample that doesn't link up to anyone because the person has not committed a prior crime, or maybe they did, and this was long before there was any kind of DNA in a database.
Yeah.
So they can actually start looking at relatives. If they don't find the person directly, they can link up a name to the DNA now. Yes. They can see similarities.
Yeah, there's a company that was not involved in the Golden State killing, but was involved in the Santa Clara County investigation of Leslie Marie Perloff's death in 1973 here in the Stanford foothills. So that company called Parabon Nanolabs describes its process as looking at kind of long stretches of DNA because family members share that.
Right.
And then they can match that instead of specific markers that were used before and probably are still used now. I think they were citing like mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA. Now they're looking at something called aDNA, autosomal DNA. Mm-hmm. And these long stretches, if you're related closely to someone, then your strands are longer that match, and then as you get more and more distant, then if you're cousins or second cousins, then shorter stretches.
And when you put that information out there in the public space, then they will tell you, for example, this is a person who is you could be either a direct sibling, or you could be a first cousin or a second cousin. So they give you what the probabilities are for each one, and you really can see a lot of information.
Yeah. So Getreu was identified as the killer of Leslie Marie Perloff.
Yes.
And that was last November, and then also this May of Janet and Taylor, also using DNA evidence, although DNA evidence based on the Santa Clara County case.
But I have a question. I know the DNA evidence is what they used to link him to it, but was he ever on the radar, or had they ever even heard of him before? Or
no.
Okay.
And that's mainly because in 1970, well, let's see, in 1963 and 1975, there weren't things. First of all, there was no DNA evidence. There was no sexual predator registry, so he just wasn't there. He was a minor at the time. Although he was 18 years old when he committed the crime in Germany, in 1963, right? In Germany, he was considered a minor because he was under the age of 21. He also committed this crime internationally. So in both cases, I've been told by law enforcement even today, someone with that kind of profile, it would be very difficult for them to get their hands on any information about them.
Because you were saying he traveled when he was young because his father was in the military.
Yes, his father was in the military, and so the family was living in Germany. And also the same thing with, ironically, the family of Margaret Williams, the girl who was killed when she was 15 years old. They also were military and stationed on the same base, although the killing did not take place on the base. It took off.
Is that how he ended up in the Bay Area? Because I was wondering how he ended up here.
Well, I tried to track as best as I could about where he was.
I know you spent a lot of time doing it.
And there were some gaps. And the main gap that I had, and even law enforcement couldn't give me any answers on this, was that basically after he got out of prison, because he was sentenced for that crime in Germany to 10 years, although clearly from evidence I've found, he did not do the entire stretch of time. The father basically ended his military career. He retired in 1969. So I'm only speculating at this point that what might have happened, but my thoughts are probably the father moved out here. Maybe they liked the Bay Area, whatever, for whatever reasons, and then he and his younger sister followed, and the younger sister married here in 1971. Getreu himself, the earliest I could find were records that he married in Reno in 1970. So that puts him on the West Coast, or in the western states.
One of the things that's I think surprising, just tracing his whereabouts here, is just how normal he seemed from the data about him. He was married, like you just said. He was living in two different places that you were able to identify between 71 and 75, one off Loma Verde, one on Alma Street at East Meadow. He had various jobs. Hospital technician, a couple hospitals, security guard.
Security guard,
Volunteer.
He was a volunteer. He also, later in the Bay Area, he had a fine woodworking business that he owned. He was an exalted ruler of the Fremont Elks Club.
Now we're jumping to the 2000s,
right. But just the point is, if you just want to stick to that time frame around the Palo Alto and the times of the murders, he had a very normal life.
Blended in. But that was exactly the stretch of time when the two murders occurred in Stanford that he's accused of.
I think you were talking to someone, and she said initially that he came across as like one of someone who would be like your favorite teacher, who that you felt comfortable talking to.
Right.
And that was before that was the woman that was raped by him later.
Right.
But in talking to people that knew him, did it seem like he had a double life? Did people, were they ever like suspicious that he might be doing crimes on the side, or what was their thoughts about him? No one and there were very few people that I could make contact with who would actually talk about his time in Palo Alto in the 70s. But during that time period, he seemed normal. I mean, even the person who, let me take that back, because there were some people, the victim from the 1975 rape told me that she never, ever expected that he would be accused. And we have to stress that because, he's only accused of these crimes. There's no conviction here on them. But that he would be accused of killing and doing the things that he was accused of doing at this point.
She wasn't aware that he had already been convicted.
That's right. She was not aware. It never came up during the court case. Nothing happened. I don't believe that any of the law enforcement people, there's no evidence that any of them ever believed that that was the case either. They didn't know anything about the 1963 crime. But essentially what happened with her is that she said that nobody talked about it until essentially after the arrest and the conviction in her case, that they then said, he was creepy, or there were things about him that, that I would have stayed away from. I never would have been around him. Whereas other people also said they were shocked. So it was like, two sides, the two sides of the coin. And she said no one ever told her during that time, stay away from him. They never warned her about it, even the people that knew. So nobody talked about these things. I don't think it's just related to the times. I think that's just kind of human nature.
Yeah. He then he married a second time. There was a divorce in the late 70s. He married someone else from this area.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the neighbor in Ohio.
Okay, yeah. Well, the timeline shows that Getreu basically, after he served and he had a very short sentence for the rape because it was pled down to statutory rape, which implies consent, but that she was underage. And clearly she, from what she's described and testified to in court documents, she was raped.
Right.
And I would say that probably after about 1978 to 79, he still lived in the Bay Area, but then he moved with his first wife back to his hometown.
Second wife.
Oh, excuse me, thank you for the second wife. Back to his hometown in Newark, Ohio. And they lived there for maybe anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Neighbors said, there was documents that show that he was part of an Explorer Scout troop there as well. But a neighbor said that he remembered him from when the neighbor was a little boy, ages about 8 to 12. And they were perfectly normal people, very kind, very nice, generous. Gave them Christmas. They didn't have any children of their own, so they would give them Christmas presents at Christmas time. And he was just absolutely shocked by, he didn't know anything about the past, the allegations now, or about the past crimes.
Now, have police shared with you whether they're investigating other crimes that he might be involved in? Are you privy to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they've publicly stated that they're investigating any other crimes that he might be involved in. The investigator one of the investigators who broke the case in San Mateo County said that it's really unusual for someone. First of all, it's unusual for someone to become be a serial killer so young in life, but it's also really unusual that they would stop simply at the age of 30, which is around the age that Getreu was in 1975, that they would just suddenly stop cold any other killings, and so or rapes. And so for that reason, they're really exploring what might have occurred in the Bay Area, and they're also sending out all of the information to law enforcement in other states. They're trying to track down where he lived and to spread that information out. They're also not speaking beyond that, and they're really, my understanding from talking to people who were in law enforcement and have worked homicide, is that's the first thing they're taught is don't say anything when it comes to homicides and sex crimes. Mm-hmm.
One of the main aspects of your story touches upon the impact of Getreu's actions on the lives of the victim siblings. So Evan Williams was the brother of Margaret Williams, who was the 15-year-old who was killed in 1963. I found it really amazing. I guess not when you think about it, but he's carried this kind of sense of burden, this torment with him for this whole life, thinking that Getreu is probably going to become a serial killer, or may.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, yeah.
He seemed like he had a feeling.
Yeah, I have to say this in both cases. I mean, what really amazed me, and it always amazes me when I've had to interview people who face these tremendous tragedies, whether it's a car accident and lost a family member, or in this case, murders, or being a victim of a crime, the willingness to talk and how generous they are and how open they are. And Evan Williams, at the very start, said to me, he prefaced our interview by saying, I don't want you to hold back on any questions. I don't want you to feel like you have to hold back on anything on my account. Mm. And he was just great, and he was 7.5 years old when his sister died. They were very close. She was the person who gave him comfort in life, as the big sister who helped him navigate his way through family situations or whatever. And to lose her is something that he has never really, you'd never get over it. It goes further back, it recedes, but it's not as raw, but it's always there. And so that's one of the things he said. He still misses his sister and always will. But he also felt that Getreu, who was this person, once again, he was privy to some information as a 7-year-old, but they've shielded him from a lot of the details. And so he wanted to know more, and throughout his life, he's tried to investigate on his own the nature of the crime. He's looked at, what has been written about Getreu in archived newspapers.
I heard that his parents withheld some information from the court hearing from him, and then later in life, there's a newspaper article that said later in life they shared that with him.
Yeah.
So he had a fuller picture of what happened.
Yes, exactly. He had a fuller picture of what happened. And he also did things like he wanted to find out and see if he could talk on his own to people who had known Getreu and his sister at that time. And he got a hold of, he purchased a yearbook from, they went to school in an American school in Germany. And he purchased his yearbook online and then tried to make contact with some of the people who were classmates. And so I think, he's also tried to, he's located where Getreu has been from time to time and found out he was in California. And then he also, when the Golden State Killer, when law enforcement was looking for information about them, he contacted them and said, here's a person that you might know that, you might want to know about, who killed my sister in Germany in 1963. So he's always carried this burden of a sense that there might be more people out there, that later in life, he said, later in life, I would find out that he had actually committed other crimes.
Yeah, I mean, you said that he was willing to talk, but at the same time, he felt sort of like it was his service, his duty.
Yes, he felt any way that, that he could contribute to helping solve other crimes or identify it. And I don't think it was really vindication. It was more like fear. It was really a deep, deep concern that he's had that other people would experience these same things.
Yeah.
With this hand of this one person.
Yeah, and you spoke to the sister of Leslie Perloff as well. And she, even though she didn't know who had committed her sister's murder, held a belief that it was a serial killer and that other people were in danger. Yeah,
well, I think because of the nature of the crimes and where they occurred, that they were on the Stanford campus, there was also a lot of discussion that, I guess she said in the press, that they also sort of labeled them as like a spate of killings or, it was like a group of killings that were happening. So that seemed to also link in her mind that this might possibly be a serial killer. So,
and she's been concerned over all these years.
Yeah, she's been concerned all of these years as well. She didn't know that it was. She didn't know that she couldn't put a name on it. Obviously, she didn't know Getreu. She didn't know anything about him. But that feeling was out there all of these years that she lived with as well. That there could be more victims that nobody had put two and two together about.
In some ways, it was probably good that the victim of rape in 1975 didn't think that he was capable of murder. So she wasn't carrying that around with her, although she did stand up and say what had happened to her at that time, because I was struck most by the quote that when she was talking to you, saying, how was it that I survived? The others are dead.
Well,
I survived. Imagine having carried that with you for your whole life.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened in her case was, and it's really chilling when you think about it, is that she testified that he had his hand around her throat during the rape, and that when she began to protest it, he began to squeeze her throat. She didn't have any marks. She didn't have any bruises. She didn't have to struggle, but the pressure was there, knowing that when she said, I'm going to, stop her, I'm going to call out to my brother who's sleeping in the other room, and he squeezed her throat and said, don't do that. You're going to get, I would have to hurt you. And those words, I think, come back to her now. Here she is living in a small town. She's got a family. She's got a career. And she's been able to put this behind her, although at the time she said the reason she came forward was because she was afraid there could be other victims that he might be raping them. But she never, ever thought that he would be a killer, despite the fact that he had his hand around her throat. That just didn't mesh. And maybe that's somewhat denial, but then when she found out, when she suddenly received this comment, when she suddenly heard from the police department or sheriff's office that they wanted to talk to her, and then she also received a letter through the Santa Clara County Sheriff from Diane Perloff asking her to please speak up and talk to investigators, then it just hit home. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I could have been. Why wasn't I killed too? These girls. It was kind of a similar situation. And so she was just really surprised. Yeah. And relieved, of course, but it brought a lot of trauma out again.
Of course. So what's next? Getreu's pleaded not guilty to Taylor's murders in San Mateo County in July.
July 15th, and the date could change, of course, as they often do. But he is scheduled to appear in court again and I believe enter a plea. We'll see what happens with that. Police will continue to do their investigations and see if he's related to any other, or linked to any other crimes in the Bay Area and elsewhere.
Okay. All right. Well, fascinating and very disturbing cases. Thanks, Sue.
Sure.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. If you think there are others who are interested in hearing about this topic, you can go below and click on the share button to share this link on social media or email. We'll see you next week.